Well, shalom all. This is your brother Martin, and I'm coming to you today with what I think is probably going to be a pretty long video. Our Creator and Heavenly Father, who I call Abba, which is Hebrew for Father, told me to release this video on the day that the Christians would call Easter. And this video ties a lot of things together. I've been preparing what you're about to see for over a week. It will have some code tables in it to confirm some of the matters that I discuss, but mainly it will correct the falsehoods around this pagan holiday called Easter. And I call it the Leaven of Babylon. And you'll understand why when we get through the material. It relates to the Passover, it relates to the crucifixion and the resurrection, and let's get into it. So, this started a few years ago when Abba gave me a code table entitled the Leaven of Babylon. That was the access term. And I really didn't understand what it meant at the time. I knew it had to deal with Edom or Rome. And I knew it meant something to do with the 10 tribes, especially when you look at the verses that were where those arrows show particular Hebrew characters. It's the way the codes work is the code confirms the text and the text confirms the code. And you're going to see that now that I give you an updated version of this 3 years later, how clear it is once he gave me an understanding of what this table really meant. The other thing he gave me at the same time 3 years ago was the fact that this leavening and the timing of Nasara were related. So Nasara being the rollout of the one world currency. This was a name given to it, and you can find that name in the codes, and I won't get into the origin of that name, but if you do who knows if the YouTube videos around this are still up or not. But the point is, this is not a big deal, but it's just an interesting timing mark, given the fact that people are talking about CBDCs and digital currencies coming onto the scene really between now and the summer. So let's get into the meat of this. So this Passover, like on all holy days, I will do what I call Bible roulette, and I will, whatever comes up, basically Abba's trying to teach me a lesson. And this time, what came up was Ezekiel 44:15, and it talks about the priests, the sons of Zadok, the Levites, who guard his set-apart place, and to draw near to him to serve him, and their characteristics and their charge. So they wear linen. They only wear that set-apart linen when they come into his inner courtyard in the Holy of Holies, and when they leave and they go back out into the common world, they take off their linen and they put their normal clothes back on, and they do not drink alcohol when they come into the inner court. They are to, and then down here it says, they are to teach my people the difference between the set apart and the profane, and make them know what is unclean and clean. So these are, his elect. When you look at the Hebrew for this, you'll see they put on flax. So linen is made from flax. And they teach the people between holiness and the profane. so that the people will know be able to discern between the clean and the unclean. So this is what it looks like in the Hebrew as originally written. That's usually what we look for when we try and find it in code tables, because all the code tables only work in the Hebrew. But I'm just showing it to you so you can understand. This is how my Bible roulette started this last Passover, which was about a week before this other holiday. So in order to understand what I'm about to explain, we have to go through a whole number of topics. This information is not usually taught all at one time. A bit of it is taught in the Jewish religion about the Passover lamb. A bit of it is taught to Christians. But generally speaking, the bigger picture is lost because it's not explained in context. And really, what Abba showed me was you have to put all of this together to understand the bigger picture. And so by giving me this piece of scripture, he led me to the bigger picture. And it sort of all comes at one time, and then I have to figure out how to explain it. And it's taken about a week to put the material together to figure out how to explain it. So the first thing to understand is the Passover lamb and the way the Jews view this Passover lamb and the ritual associated with it. And, when I say Jews, I mean the tribe of Yehuda. It is one of the 12 tribes. So maybe by looking at my last videos or looking at other videos that you've found, if you are in the Hebrew Roots movement or any of these other trying to get back to the original meaning of the Bible, you'll know that the Passover ritual is associated, obviously, with the Exodus from Egypt, where the Jews, the tribe of Yehuda, and all of the other tribes were taken out of Egypt, which is Mitzrayim in Hebrew, and they were taken to the desert for 40 years so that unclean generation would die off, and then the next generation was given their inheritance, which was the promised land. And so the Jews, the tribe of Yehuda, always associates this ritual with the promised land because that's what the ritual means. And the ritual was to slaughter a lamb and put the blood on the doorposts so that the destroyer would pass by and not smite the firstborn of the Israelites, so that the Israelites would then be released and eventually inhabit the promised land. So that's the first understanding of the Passover lamb, was that you put this on your doorpost so that the destroyer passes over you because you are marked as an Israelite. You are marked as set apart from the Egyptians. And so this set apartness and the idea of the promised land is related to each other in that way. That is not the final meaning of the Passover lamb. But to understand that final meaning, you have to understand the sin ritual and the ark. Because now, once they were in the promised land, before, while they still had the Ark of the Covenant, before they were invaded by the Babylonians, what would happen every year is that at Passover, in remembrance of this event, they would slaughter a lamb without blemish, and then the high priest, in his linens, would take the blood of the lamb and sprinkle it on the mercy seat of the Ark of the Covenant, by which the blood of the lamb would atone for the sins of the people for that year, and Abba would forgive their sins by this ritual. And so the sin offering, the lamb, the high priest, and the Ark of the Covenant are all sort of bound into this ritual that occurred before the Israelites transgressed the will of Yahuwah, and he allowed them to be invaded by the Babylonians and ultimately scattered into the diaspora. So just remember this relationship between the blood, the lamb, the high priest, and the Ark of the Covenant. We're going to come back to that. Next thing to understand are the harvests. the Bible has a whole bunch of different harvests in there. I have an entire video on just the harvest, which I will link in the upper right-hand corner right now if you want to go look at that. So there's an entire video just on the harvest, but there are multiple harvests, starting with barley, and then there are other grains, sometimes harvested at the same time, but you have flax and wheat. And then there are other harvests like the grape harvest and the olive harvest and these other harvests. But the most, the ones that I think are the most important to what I'm about to explain are the grain harvest. It starts with the barley, and the barley harvest is what sets which month starts the calendar, Abba's calendar, the one that is that you discern by the phases of the moon. And the times and the names have all been changed, but basically the way that you would discern which month was the first month was in relation to the equinox, and essentially you would look at the barley crop and determine whether it was Abib, the Hebrew word, meaning that at least 10% was ripe enough to pick. And so when the barley was Abib, and you had a new month, that would then be set as the month of Abib. And that is the first month. Now they've renamed it Nisan and whatever. But the point is that this notion of the Abibness of barley and setting the month of Abib as the first month of the year is something that is true and documented. And so Abib is very important, and barley is very important to understanding the calendar, the timing of Abba's feasts, and the ability to discern dates and prescribed times. So, point being that these harvests, then you harvest the grain, and Leviticus, it says what you do with the first parts of the harvest, which are the first fruits, and you offer them up to Abba, and you do something called wave sheaf, and there's all these things that you do if you're following the covenant to the letter. What's more important, in my view, to explain these days is the spirit of the covenant and the lessons that it teaches, which have largely been lost with this idea that the Messiah being nailed to the cross ended the covenant. And I will explain how the crucifixion ended the blood sacrifice, but not the covenant. And so these other things, the calendar, the harvest, these all still apply. So mainly, once you have a harvest, and after you do all these things with the first fruits to give thanks, you have the grain that's left over. And what would you do from that? Well, he would make something like bread. In fact, back then, that's probably the only thing you made with it was bread. And what happens immediately after Passover is you have a feast called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And I'm in the middle of the Feast of Unleavened Bread right now. And I think the Feast of Unleavened Bread is just there to teach you how much better bread is with leaven. And the Feast of Unleavened Bread is for self-examination. Essentially, you remove the leaven from your house. You do not eat leaven. Leaven represents corruption. And so, there are people who look to the letter of the law and they try and get rid of all the leavening agents in their house, and I think they're missing the point, is that it's to distinguish between the pure without leaven and then the bread with the leaven. And in fact, that like I said, leavened bread is much tastier than unleavened bread. And it doesn't matter whether you agree with me or not. That's just what I think. And I think that's a whole point, is that leavening agent actually makes bread better, even though it's viewed as corruption. So it's a duality. It's like you want to get rid of corruption in your life, but actually the bread is much better when you introduce a little bit of corruption and let nature take its course. And I will get into a lot more to do with leaven and bread later. But just remember that there's unleavened bread, there's leavened bread, and there's a difference between them. And it might not be as easy to just say one is good and one is bad. And then the last concept to understand here is when Yahusha met the Canaanite woman who came and asked his favor. And he said to her, and this is documented in Matthew 15:24, that he was only sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So first thing is you have to understand what is the house of Israel. And this is explained in a video called The Identity Crisis, which I'll get into in a minute. But generally it's agreed by everybody that the house of Israel represents the 10 northern tribes who were exiled. And then you have the house of Yehuda, which was 2 tribes in the south, who were not exiled from the land because they did not devolve into the idol worship that the house of Israel did. And that the tribe of Yehuda remained in the land, but realized that the house of Israel, the 10 tribes of the north, were exiled, and so thus maintained the opinion that you, northern 10 tribes, are exiled from the promised land and are not allowed to return. And so this is why the 10 northern tribes are called the lost sheep. It's because they are not allowed to return to the promised land. And to the tribe of Yehuda, the promised land is everything. The Passover had to do with this. The sacrifice of the lamb had to do with this. The whole point of being an Israelite had to do with this. And so the 10 northern tribes, having been banished from the land, are now the lost sheep. Okay, so the key concept here, related to the lost sheep and related to bread and leaven, are that the lost sheep are the leaven in the loaf of the Gentiles. And the Gentiles, in Hebrew being goyim, meaning nations, which is where we are today, all of the nations, the united nations and the ununited nations. We are all nations in these days. And so what does he mean? What do I mean by the lost sheep are the leaven in the loaf of the Gentiles? Well, when those 10 northern tribes were exiled, they went to Greece and they went to Europe and they went all over the place, and they intermingled with, what the tribe of Yehuda would call the heathen, and mixed their seed in with the seed of the heathen and interbred and are now indistinguishable from the goyim. Just keep that in mind. Let's move on again and talk about this video that was made by a pastor named Jim Staley about what he called the identity crisis. And I'm going to relate this to, what the Christians would call St. Paul, whose real name was Saul because he was actually a rabbi from the Pharisees who was converted by the Messiah to his cause, and Paul spreading the good news. Well, what was this good news? Well, so as you can see from this screenshot from YouTube, this video that Jim Staley has made is almost 3 hours long. Now, if you go and find this video, he quotes, there's an incredible amount of scripture that he quotes to make this proof of the fact that the 10 northern tribes of Israel are not only the lost sheep, but that everybody currently alive is a descendant of these 10 northern tribes, unless they are a descendant of the tribe of Yehuda, which is currently in the land of Israel, the political piece of land in the Middle East called Israel, but actually that the people Israel are all of us, because we've all been brought into Israel by the fact that the lost sheep were scattered into the loaf of the Gentiles, and by interbreeding have now created this this greater Israel that nobody identifies because it is hidden. And I'll get into this explanation a little bit more, but what Pastor Staley hypothesizes and, in my opinion, proves is that the original covenant between Abba, the Creator, and the Israelites was a marriage contract, and there is no way to really break a marriage contract in Hebraic law, except for if you have a groom and a bride, and they get married, then there's nothing the bride can do to be released from that contract. The only thing that releases the bride from that contract is the death of the groom. And what he does in this 3 hours is go through all the scriptures that validate the fact that the Messiah was the groom and Israel is the bride. And by sacrificing himself on the cross, the Messiah was released the bride, meaning the lost sheep, from the contract so that the covenant could be renewed. And that's why we call it the renewed covenant, not the new covenant, because the covenant was in effect, and it's still in effect with the tribe of Yehuda, but the northern tribes had to be released from the covenant by this sacrifice. And I will get into some more proof around this. Now, if you do go watch this video, I will advise you to skip the first half hour. It's a bunch of marketing, but the proofs get in there about half an hour to 45 minutes in. It is a very good video. It's worth watching. I recommend it if you want to take the time to watch it. All right, so I've made a lot of claims and explanations, so let's get into the last, I think, concept that matters, the Last Supper, the bread and the wine. So the Messiah sits down with his disciples and explains to them that this is what's going to happen, that in order for the covenant to be renewed, he, as the groom, is going to be crucified and die to release the lost sheep. And they don't understand. And he just uses a metaphor. He uses the bread, and he breaks the bread and says, "This is my body which will be broken." And then he uses the wine to say that this is his blood that will be shed to achieve Abba's purpose. And so the bread is very important, because when you look at the Hebrew, the bread he is using is leavened bread. And we'll talk about why it's leavened bread and why Passover and unleavened bread are strongly associated, but why he used leavened bread to make his point. So let's get into that. And what he said is documented in Luke chapter 22, and of course we all know it. If you've ever been a Christian, this is said all the time in Christian churches. So the key part of the understanding that Abba delivered to me was in the next part of Ezekiel 44 from my Bible roulette on this last Passover, which is that in verse 28, he says, "It shall be to them for an inheritance. I am their inheritance." This is Abba, Yahuwah, speaking to Ezekiel. "I am their inheritance, and you give them no possession in Israel," meaning the land. "I am their possession." So what he is saying to Ezekiel is that the tribe of Yehuda consider the land of Israel, the physical land, their inheritance, because that's what was promised to them. But for you, the priests, the lost sheep, I am your inheritance. And you don't get a possession in the land of Israel because I am your inheritance. So if we go back to the Last Supper for a minute, if we all agree that the Messiah was Abba in human form, meaning the Creator in flesh walking the earth, now you understand what he means when he says, "I am your inheritance." He is telling Ezekiel he will be the one to sacrifice himself in human form to absolve the sins of the lost sheep and renew the covenant. And that's what really matters. In the Christian tradition, the day of resurrection is what's celebrated. But what really matters in Abba's plan, which of course he's all-knowing, he saw from the beginning, and he even wrote before it happened and told it to Ezekiel, was that by being the Passover lamb and the perfect sacrifice, he would absolve the house of Israel from their sins and thus reintegrate all the nations into the promise of Israel, and that he is our inheritance. I cannot overstress the importance of this enough. So we are going to find this in the codes. And to know what those are in the codes, you have to find the Hebrew. And so when we look at Ezekiel 44:28 in the Hebrew, where he says, I am their inheritance, it's that he is our inheritance, allotment. So this is the phrase, Strong's H589 and 5159. These two words together are the words, I am their inheritance. So we will find that, and I'll show you, it's amazing when I show you the code tables associated with that phrase. All right, so this is the first one. I am their inheritance, says Abba Yehoiah. So in this one, it's an ELS at a skip of 366, reversed in the books of Daniel and Ezra. Again, a very small area, only about 6,700 characters of the surface text. So highly statistically significant. Again, I'm confirming a matter. I'm not making predictions, not setting dates. I'm just, in order to confirm what I'm describing to you, I'm using this Bible code to confirm it. And so first confirmation is we find it as an ELS with all these terms about how the Passover lamb, so the Passover, the Pesach, and Passover, Pesach. This one in plain text, this one is an ELS. And the lamb is the leaven of the Goyim. And that the Messiah, Yahushua, was anointed as that lamb for Yahuwah, the Elohim of Israel. Now, if I look at this table, you will see the access term, I am their inheritance, here. And you will see that whose inheritance? The nations, the Goyim, right? They are anointed to receive this inheritance. And right over Pesach, in the plain text, encoded as a skip of 2, is the lamb, right, which is sacrificed on Pesach. Now, the other thing about this is that you have who is the lamb? It's Yeshua here. And you have the term, they shall understand, which refers to the remnant. Wherever we see the remnant, we have the hedge. The hedge protects the remnant. We see the hedge as a banner across this entire thing. And here is the remnant, and parallel to the remnant is the Pesach. You see encoded inside the hedge is to the end of days. And then you have, this term I didn't, so this is my name, actually. I didn't put it in here, but it appears in the table. And I believe that 5783, which is the current year, is the year that I find the table. And I just put 5783 because it skips throughout this. It sort of covers this entire table is 5783, which is Hey, where's the Tau? Tau, Shin, Pei, and then the Gimel, which is the 3, is just above this page. I just cut it off so I could fit this. But it sort of covers this entire table. The other thing that covers this entire table is the word crucifixion. So this character, this character, this character. Crucifixion covers the whole table. This entire thing relates to the crucifixion and what the crucifixion means. And as you can see, crucified also appears here for Yahuwah. So I think a pretty amazing table showing how by Yahushua being Abba in human form, being crucified as the Lamb on Pesach, the remnant and the nations are anointed to receive Abba as their inheritance. So that's the first. This is at an ELS of, like I said, 366 in the reverse. All right, one last thing to say about this table is that there is a rule that the code confirms the text of the Bible and the text of the Bible confirms the code. This, as you can see, table is encoded over Ezra 2 and mostly Daniel 12. And Ezra 2 is a listing of the family names of the Israelites who were returned from exile in Babylon. And Daniel 12, I'm putting it on screen now so you can see how it reads, is amazing. Because it describes the end of days and what happens during the end of days to fulfill this inheritance. The next one, which I just wanted to show you this one first so you understand the relationships between these terms, is the same term in the plain text in Ezekiel 44. And the most amazing thing about this is that all these same terms are encoded exactly where my Bible roulette was in Ezekiel 44. And it refers to basically all of the world now, Edom, at a skip of 7. And the remnant, these are the same thing, at a skip of 7. And then the most amazing thing, which you might see if you look hard at the table, is this last one, the Lamb, encoded at a skip of 12 in the reverse. Pretty amazing. Right where it says, I am their inheritance. And you give them no possession in Israel. I am their possession. Wow. So all of these terms are encoded in the plain text of Ezekiel 44. Right where that Bible roulette is, and right where that phrase is said. In fact, the Lamb is encoded right between where it says, I am their inheritance, and the next phrase that is the sin offering. So I did not annotate all of these. I only want to point out that key relationship where he says, to the house of Israel, I am their inheritance, here in the plain text of Ezekiel 44. And then the Lamb is encoded right after that. And the next phrase says, the sin offering. And Yahusha's name is encoded right over where it says the sin offering, which is encoded right above for Yahuwah. And the text, right where Yahusha's name is encoded, also says that he's the first fruits. So, pretty incredible. And I think the whole point of having this year in here was this is the year that I originally found the first table that relates to this. So, a pretty exciting find. I was blown away by it, and maybe I need to tie it together because I'm excited by it, but maybe I'm not doing as good a job of explaining what it all means. So, if we go back to the sin ritual and the ark, and some of you might have already, since you've already been studying some of this, might have already made all these connections just from the tables I showed you. But if you haven't, I'm going to spell it out because this is worth everybody understanding. It is profound, and it hit me like a ton of bricks, and I thank Abba for revealing it, and I'm praying that I do a good job explaining it. So if you look at the sin ritual and the high priest and the blood of the lamb sprinkled on the Ark of the Covenant, at the time Yahushua walked the earth, he was the high priest. The Pharisees weren't the priest. He was far more holy than any of the Pharisees, and they all knew it. So he, being the high priest, and also simultaneously being the lamb, to fulfill Abba's perfect pattern, and all of Abba's patterns are perfect, would somehow have to sprinkle his own blood on the mercy seat of the Ark of the Covenant, which at the time was lost, because when the Babylonians invaded, the Ark was lost, and the Bible never makes any mention of it anymore, which is why people say they don't know where it is. However, those of you who have been in the Hebrew Roots movement will recall this guy named Ron Wyatt, an archaeologist, who claimed to have found the Ark of the Covenant. And not only that he found it right underneath the rock on which Yahushua was crucified, and that, as the account in the Bible relates, at the moment of his death, the earth split, the rock underneath the cross split, and his blood, which was running down the cross, ran through that crack and then hit the top of the mercy seat of the Ark of the Covenant, which was hidden underneath the rock on which he was crucified. And amazingly enough, some of these videos are still on YouTube. I mean, I just did this search yesterday, and you can see that, you can just put Ron Wyatt, Ark of the Covenant, all that into YouTube search, and then you can decide for yourself with what this person is saying. But many of us believe that what he found is true, and he believed this to his core. I will give you a little more evidence in that there were also some videos made by Michael Rood. He made a 9-part series called The Ark of the Covenant, and he made another DVD called The Secrets of the Temple of Solomon, which talked about a sand hydraulic mechanism that was created by the priests, so that if the temple was ever invaded, the slab on which the Ark of the Covenant sat would drop into the hidden passages of the Temple Mount and be hidden from any invaders so they could not be taken and looted. And so, in fact, what Michael Rood, in our opinion, because I worked this out not just by myself, but with my brothers and sisters in my study group, was that what Michael Rood proved was that this hydraulic sand mechanism is what deposited the Ark of the Covenant exactly where it was found by Ron Wyatt. And so by this series of circumstances over hundreds of years, Abba created the conditions by which Yeshua, as the high priest and simultaneous the Lamb, could offer himself as the perfect sacrifice on that Passover, and thus atone and take on the sins of all of the people, being the lost sheep of Israel, and by his death then releasing them from the marriage covenant. So achieving both purposes in this one act, in those two roles. And so again, you can find this video out there as well and take a look at what it says. And this then puts a nice neat bow on the entire identity crisis line of reasoning that Jim Staley laid out there. So that means the lost sheep are the leaven in the loaf of the Gentiles, and that this loaf is all of us, and that the leaven of the lost sheep from the 10 northern tribes of Israel, by breeding into us over many generations, have brought us into the fold, which now receive the benefit of our Messiah's perfect sacrifice on that day. And so it's because the lost sheep have been integrated into the nations, which today would be called Babylon, the new Babylon, like leaven. So when you make bread, you put all the ingredients in, and the last thing you do is you put a little bit of leaven in there. But once you mix it up, you can't tell where the leaven is. The leaven's just all throughout the loaf. Another way to think about this is the idea of dye poured into water. So if you put a little bit of blue dye in a glass of water, and you just wait through what's called Brownian motion, the dye will mix with the water and eventually it will be a uniform shade of blue. Now, the thing about this is if you use only a few drops, like if you think about the ratio of the leaven in all of the ingredients of the bread, think about using a big vat of water, which represents the nations, and a few drops of blue dye, which represents the lost sheep, and putting a few drops into a big vat of water and letting it, waiting and letting it mix. Would you be able to see the blue dye? No. It would still just look like a big vat of water. But the blue dye is there. It's been mixed into the entire big vat of water. And that's kind of how Babylon is today. Those lost sheep have been integrated into the nations, just like leaven is into bread, and just like the blue dye is into the big vat of water. So, let's look at the final code, which is the leaven of Babylon. And you will see that Pesach, Passover, which occurs on the 14th of Abib, per Leviticus, is where Yahushua, as the Lamb, was crucified. So let's take a look. So this is an updated version of that first table I was shown 3 years ago. Vertically here, the access term, Leaven of Babylon. Crossing through and sharing the bait is 14 Abib, right here. Crossing through just below that is the Lamb. And then connecting both of those is Yahushua, anointed as the Lamb for the remnant. And that in these days they shall understand. And that the nations are leavened for Yehoiah by his being crucified. It's interesting that anointed and crucifixion form a cross. Wherever we see the remnant, we also see the hedge, which protects the remnant. And as we've said, leaven, yeast, represents corruption. But in fact, by doing this, he eliminates the corruption, because by creating the sin offering on Pesach, he's actually removing corruption, which is what Samael, the spirit of evil, does not want. So, for me, pretty amazing table. But for me, this is, proof of, or confirmation rather. There's no proof, it's what you believe. So this is confirmation of the relationship between Passover, the Lamb, the sin ritual, the high priest, the Messiah, and his sacrifice, and what it means for the lost sheep of the house of Israel, and why he said that to the Canaanite woman. So now going back to the Last Supper, understanding what we now understand. The Israelites, for Passover, were told exactly what to do with the lamb. It was selected at a specific time. It was killed at a specific time on the specific day of the 14th of Abib. And it was eaten in haste with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, because that is the conditions that were there during the Exodus from Mitzrayim, or Egypt. So when the Messiah did this with his disciples, if he was the one sacrificed as the lamb on the cross at the time specified on the 14th of Abib, then when was this meal? When was the Last Supper in relation to Passover? Well, it was the night before. This is why he's using leavened bread. And this is why when you translate the Hebrew, it shows that it's leavened bread, because he's talking about the relationship of the leaven to the nations and how his disciples are going to be part of that. And so, what other evidence do we have of this line of explanation that I just provided? Well, there is this time known as the fullness of the Gentiles. Again, Gentiles being nations. What happens with a loaf of bread? Well, you take the grain, you mill it, you put it on a threshing floor, which is called the tribulum, which is where we get tribulation from. It's that the grain is being threshed on the threshing floor with the tribulum. And once you have the grain separated from the chaff, you mill it, you put in the leaven, you make a lump, and then you wait. Because the only thing that will allow it to rise is time. And then once you have the leavened loaf, the lump, you put it in an oven and you bake it in the fire. So when is the loaf of the nations ready? Well, it's at this time known as the fullness of the Gentiles. That's when the loaf is fully risen, or the lump is fully risen. Loaf being the baked version of the bread after you baked it in the fire. Well, there's a time frame set out in Ezekiel 4, which is a 2,730-year time frame that says the awakening of the tribe of Ephraim and the remnant will occur at the end of this curse that causes them to forget. And so I'm showing you a table that was originally published by our code searcher brother Scott Bunnell about the expiration of this 2,730-year curse in Ezekiel 4, which indicates the timing of the fullness of the Gentiles. And when you do the math, you get that curse expired in the year 2010 by our modern numbering, and that the tribe of Ephraim will awaken. And this year and this anomaly of the tribe of Ephraim awakening are connected by the line in Genesis 48:19 that says, his seed will become the fullness of the Gentiles. The most amazing thing about, and so, by the way, this is considered the birthright of Ephraim, that they will remember him. Birthright of Ephraim, they will remember me, says Abba. And one of the most amazing things about this table is that the skip of this table is 2,730. There's another table that talks about the fullness of the Gentiles, also published by our brother Scott Bunnell, which is encoded around the access term, the fullness of the Gentiles. And also paralleling it vertically, which indicates a very strong relationship between the two terms, is the year 2010. The fulfillment of the 430 years multiplied by 7 per the math. For the remnant made up of Ephraim and the lost sheep, they will remember their inheritance. Judah will remember the anointed of Yahuwah. And that it's sevenfold times 430 is the end of the curse. In the latter days, meaning the end of days. So, with that, we get to the loaf being ready to bake in the fire. And so you have the accounts of what the Messiah did with the fishes and the loaves. The fishes are harvested without being killed. You don't have to kill the fish. You harvest the fish and they're ready to use. And then after you harvest the fish, you bake the loaves. And that is, in metaphor, Abba's perfect plan for the redemption of the world. So I hope this was a great baruching to you all. And I hope that Abba gave me the words that allow me to convey what it really means. And years ago, I did another presentation. This was in the Code Searcher class on the pagan holiday of Easter and how it was really a ritual to Ishtar, which is a goddess of fertility, which is why you have eggs and bunnies. And that video has apparently been removed. So I will have to go dig up my copy of it and post it here and then eventually link back to this video. Because this is the true meaning of what the Messiah said when he said, I come for the lost sheep of the house of Israel, and what his sacrifice as the lamb and simultaneously the high priest means, and the true interpretation of the crucifixion and the resurrection. So with that, I'm going to say thanks for watching. If you've been here this long, I thank you for staying till the end to see this entire presentation, and I will see you in the next video.